Hi, this is going to be the last video of the time-lapse series, so it makes sense that I'm just going to briefly go over some finishing touches and little details to polish the scene, to just enhance the image in general. And it actually has quite a large impact. One thing I've noticed that has become a recurring theme throughout the semester is that some people have a lack of material variation, and this is especially noticeable in the floors. So the first thing that I'm going to do in this time-lapse video is create some variation for my tileable floor pattern, because if you don't have that variation and the tileable pattern, the white tiles, the typical white tiles, are pretty much everywhere, they are going to start to feel like bathroom tiles rather than something sci-fi. So I'm just going to create a set, as I've done before for different objects, some 90-degree bends, one towards the left and one towards the right. Just be careful that if you bend something, it doesn't automatically grid snap. Even if you measured them neatly, sometimes you just have to pull some vertices around to make sure that they snap. And I'm just going to lay these on top of my floor, so I do have to make sure that in the texture, so in my UV layouts, the borders are taken into account. Then I have three materials in Max, where I feed to have an overview of what I'm doing, I feed the AO map of the trim texture in there. And I just put a placeholder rubber metal paint material in Max, and then I recreate them in Unreal. So these translate to material IDs in Unreal, and I can just recreate them there. Then if you kind of stick to this 90-degree and straight rounded 90-degree corners and straight pieces, then everything is neatly going to fit, but at a certain point I run into cases where there is no 90-degree angle, there's a slightly different angle. I don't even know what kind of angle, but what I can do there is switch over to a spline driven setup. I have the amount of segments, so I can just put this into my spline and then switch over from having the modular set to a spline for the more difficult corners. I have split up the straight piece for one straight spline piece that has enough segments, because I want to be able to rotate it and turn it, and then I have one piece that is just straight and where I've removed all of the segments. You can also use it for your ceilings if you're a bit creative. But you'll notice that this automatically gives you a lot of extra detail and sort of breaks up the bathroom tiles. So it's a very simple thing to do, but it automatically makes your level look a lot more interesting. In the previous videos, one of the previous videos, I've shown the use of decal with an actual decal object in Unreal, and I used it for leaking. But decals can also still apply in the way that you're more familiar, just manually made planes that you can then manually position in Unreal as well. And as mentioned in the stream, this can also improve the overall image quite a bit, make it look more interesting. If you have certain signs, warning signs, maybe labels to scatter a little bit across your level. Obviously you're going to need a texture that you can then in Unreal multiply with a color, but you will also need a mask, and those two are not going to be the same, so it might be a good idea to gray pack these the way we gray packed textures before. So it can just, since these are small decals, I'm just going to give them one value because this is cheaper. I'm not going to make a separate roughness map for this. And I'm just putting them all on around the origin, putting the pivot point, centering the pivot point, And actually, if you use planes in Unreal, you don't need a deferred decal material. You can just use a standard material that uses an opacity mask. And be careful, because it doesn't always make sense to have letters in your, or very complex shapes in your opacity mask. It doesn't always make sense that people make letter-shaped stickers or signs. So sometimes the mask and the actual texture can be a bit different. Obviously, something that really brings a level to life is something that moves, and as mentioned in the stream before, particle effects can be a great way to get some movement going on in the scene. You can make particle effects yourselves if you feel comfortable with Cascade or Niagara, but you can also just use a couple of the very decent particle effects that are in the showcase starter pack of Unreal. You just have to copy over the particle effect itself, then the depending materials and the textures that are used in the material. You can just manually copy them over into your project and place them in the scene. They are sensitive to lighting, so they always kind of look a little bit better if you position them close to a light, so that you can see the smoke react to the light. It is of course always an option to open them up in Cascade and tweak them a little bit yourselves. As an extension of the master trim material that you all have, that currently, well, in my project at least, has a paint layer with a metal layer underneath, I decided to create a separate material function called MF Rust in this case, and this is going to have a couple of rust textures in the function already. And it's also going to specifically blend my textures with the material that I use as a function input in this case. You can see one particular rust grunge map that I created myself, so it's definitely okay to create grunge maps yourselves, like the scratch mask that we use in the example to then blend with a likeliness curvature derived mask. Since Rust has a slightly different way of spreading, uses slightly different patterns. And then one of the main things in the way that this blends is that I apply a secondary color. So I've got my rust textures, and then in addition to those rust textures I have a bleeding color, because rust tends to bleed a little bit, have a sort of a soft glow around the rust stains where the paint starts to turn a little bit more towards yellow or orange. So you can see me lerping the base color input from our input material. You can see me lerping it with the vector 3 that's going to represent my rust bleeding first, and then afterwards I use a second lerp to actually put the rust in. Then I have a couple of parameters that I exposed. The color of the paint obviously is still a parameter, but on top of this we have the color of the bleeding. I can specify how intense both the rust and the bleeding are, and I have power nodes behind the multiply nodes to specify how sharp the bleeding is going to be. If I want a very soft stain, as you can see over here, or I want to make it slightly sharper. And then you can notice that depending on what color of paint color that lies underneath, you might have to slightly change the bleeding color as well. There we go. For the remaining maps, I did not go as far as to put the bleeding in the bleeding pattern in the remaining maps, like metalness, roughness. Metalness even has just one value. You can see me put 0 in there, since rust is a dielectric. But for instance, the roughness map and the normal map come from one lerp, which is the main rust lerp, the first lerp. Obviously the tiling. In this example the tiling is a little bit too visible still, but that's something that you can easily fix as we've shown, easily fixed with a couple of additional cloud maps to then blend over it to create more variation, or even have the patterns depend on the position of your object, of your particular object in the world. And you can see that this works quite well, apart from the tiling then. I also slightly changed the paint color to something a little bit more brown. And the main rust is a blend that comes from the AO instead of the curvature. This time it comes from the AO, and it is blended with my custom rust grunge map. You can see. I'm just trying out some different colors to see what type of color palette blends well with the brown tones of the rust. And then in the end I put one additional parameter, which is just an on-off switch, basically a multiplier after the entire chain, so that I don't have to put all the parameters to 0 in a scenario where I don't want any rust, which makes it easier. And then a very typical sci-fi cliche that nonetheless always works very well is cables, and some of you already have cables implemented in your levels. But what I've seen is that some people tend to use one single spline as a cable, which would mean that if you want an interesting looking bunch of cables spread all across your level, you would need a tremendous amount of splines. So it might be a good idea to sort of make the one mesh that you're going to feed into your spline, make that a little bit more interesting, or give it a little bit of extra variation in max before you put it in the spline. And then you can still combine different splines with each other, but at least one spline in Unreal already has a little bit of variation going on and looks a bit interesting. And you can see that this was nicely shown in the example that Ruben showed in the previous stream, but you can see that this can work very well to guide a player's focus towards a certain point in the level. So cables are a very nice way of doing that. Just putting some additional wet decals on the floor to create more variation, because I felt like I needed some variation in that area. You want a bit of variation, but of course you don't want to go overboard. And then this is the cable that I used previously, but this one was a little bit too unique and a little bit too big to use everywhere. But of course you can still sort of combine different types of cables. It's always a good idea more variation only makes the level look more interesting. And this one I specifically placed there because I can then use it as I can combine it with a tiny light source and use it as an excuse to put some extra light there, because I felt like this corner was much too dark, and now I can just put a very subtle blue rectangle light over there in that corner, which gives me a soft blue glow on the top of my door there. And there we go, a nice cable leading the player's focus into the right direction. So this, in combination with the lighting that I put right above the door, creating a color contrast along with the cables indicating where you should go, is a very subtle way of giving the player some hints. And of course, instead of just hanging them on the ceiling, hanging them in the sky, in the air, you can also reuse the same cables to put on the floor. It also works quite well to sort of break the symmetry and give your level that natural, messy look. And next to polishing and decorating, something that also helps the overall quality of a level along, is just creating more detail in the assets themselves. Obviously, And I find a very handy way to apply the trim sheets is by starting from splines. Just starting from splines, sort of chamfering the sharpest corners, and these splines can then be modified, but it's just a matter of doing a strip unwrap and putting them somewhere over the trim sheet. Giving this barrel, this is the barrel that came from the set of meshes that you got from us. Giving this barrel just a little bit more detail, nothing too complex, because it's not supposed to be a very detailed hero asset. It's just a very subtle barrel that I'm going to use to just scatter around the level, and hopefully use in a very modular way, or be able to use in a very modular way. So the detail that I'm putting on there, just putting some planes and some shells, I'm putting on there is not extreme. Sometimes, yes, sometimes the chamfers can be a bit messy and you have to manually clean them up. Now what you can also do is start from a round spline and then just delete a couple edges and then re-chamfer them manually. And then it's just like any other asset, a matter of selecting strips, straightening them, and positioning them over a certain part of the trim mesh. Just more of the same, really. I have a nice alternation between resting areas that are a bit easy on the eyes, not super busy or noisy, that just give the roughness map a chance to show its nice details. Because I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make in the beginning, is thinking that they need a lot of intense concentration of detail pretty much everywhere. While these meshes, if you combine a lot of meshes into one scene, it generally works a lot better if all the assets, the meshes, are quite simple, really. And then again, put some material IDs on there, and you can see that I already start to see some possibilities of how to use this mesh in a modular way. Right? You can shove them through the walls, you can shove them through the ceilings, just generally use them everywhere where the level is still a bit empty. Or what you could also do, if they're just a vague asset that could represent pretty much everything, you could just scatter them on the floor. They could be empty batteries or empty barrels of some kind. Doesn't really have to be anything specific. Sci-fi is a very forgiving genre to decorate your scenes. I'm just going from one certain camera angle because I want this angle to really look as good as possible. So sometimes I tweak my level going from a certain camera angle. And then there's the post-processing, obviously, is something that can enhance your level quite a bit. I generally don't overdo it with my post-processing. If you have to do too much post-processing, that's usually an indication that something is wrong with your level. The only things I sort of tweak a little bit is the gain, the offset, just under the general tab in the color grading section. Maybe make the shadows a little bit more, drag them a little bit more towards blue or purple. And then tweak the AO and the overall exposure, and that's usually it. Maybe some bloom, indeed. Set my bloom to convolution. That's generally gives nice results. And then the last thing I'm going to show in this video is how to set up camera cuts. So make a cutscene with different cameras. So I've positioned a couple cameras in my level right now. got one close to the stairs and then one closer to the door on the right there. And if you just select those cameras and start creating tracks from this, going from the selection in your editor, the sequencer will automatically create camera cuts there. So it's just a matter of importing the cameras. You do have to import them a second time within the camera cuts track, but it's just a matter of choosing how long they will take. And then within that time frame, the camera cut will switch to a certain camera. You can animate its position. I generally advise you to stick to simple panning motions for those cameras. Don't do anything too experimental or too freaky. Just keep it simple, keep it calm. You can also, to bring a little bit more life into your scene, reuse a couple of assets that you have. Like for instance, I also use the barrels to create sort of a drone. And then the same way I animate my camera movements, I can animate the drone and time it in a way that when my last camera just moves forward, the drone is a little bit in frame and then just leaves the frame immediately. Lens flares is something you can do, but maybe you want to stay clear of that, since that's also something super cliche, especially in sci-fi. And then just by putting some emissive materials on the same barrel object, it kind of looks like a drone. And just by linking in the world outliner, linking this together, you can even add some smoke. And then there you go, that's our final cut. Levels far from finished, but at least it looks polished enough to present already, and in the end that's really all that matters. The presentation is everything. So that's it, thanks for watching and good luck.